Saludos a todos mis amigas y amigos y bienvenidos a esta lección sobre la conjugación regular.
That's right, my friends. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about regular conjugation. But before we get to the regular bit of things, let's discuss what conjugation is first. Here we see la conjugación, or conjugation. This is when we change the verb's spelling according to who is performing the action. Now that sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook until you realize that we already know how to conjugate two very important verbs. In fact, that's what we've talked about in our past couple of lessons. So let's have a look at those verbs. Ser and estar. Now remember how we talk about the point of view. It determines which of these we pick. So if I said my grandmother and I are, then it would be first person plural. So mi abuela y yo, we choose somos, that first person plural. Notice we've changed the spelling of ser depending on who is doing the being in this case. And the same thing applies to estar. If I said you are, then it would be tú estás. Tú estás. We changed the spelling of estar to the estás version because you is second person singular. This is all conjugation is, and we already know how to do it. So take heart. However, these two verbs that we've discussed, these verbs are called irregular verbs. That is, we don't have a pattern that applies to them to make them easy to remember. Most verbs, however, do follow a very specific pattern, and that pattern is what we're going to learn today. We call that pattern regular conjugation. So we saw with ser and estar, those are verbos irregulares. They don't follow the pattern I'm about to teach you. This verb down below here, however, tocar, this is a regular verb, un verbo regular. And we're going to learn how to conjugate verbs just like this, depending upon who is doing the action, whether it's first, second, third, singular, plural. So, before we begin, we need to talk about the anatomy of the infinitive. La anatomía del infinitivo. Now, this infinitivo, this infinitive bit here, an infinitive is simply a verb that has not been conjugated. All right? So it has not been changed into those 6 different forms. So the infinitive of the verb to be in Spanish is simply ser. And then the infinitive, the other one, to be, is estar. They've still got that AR ending on the estar, and it's got that ER ending on the ser, which actually those are 2 examples of 3 possible infinitive endings. You can see here in the parentheses down at the bottom, there are 3 types of endings for all verbs in the whole language. All right, that is for all infinitives, unconjugated verbs. We have AR verbs, we have ER verbs, and we have IR verbs. All right, so ser is an ER verb, estar is an AR verb, and then we'll see an example of an IR verb as we get going. So let's look at this verb, tocar. Now, tocar is from our vocab. Tocar música, I believe, is what we have on our vocab list, to play music. And then tocar can actually mean to touch as well. Tocar is to touch. Now let's look at how this word breaks down. We have la terminación, that AR ending on there. You can see this is an AR verb. The remainder of this that you see in orange here, this is called the stem, the raíz, as we would call it in Spanish. So the part of the verb after you take off the AR, the part that you see here in orange, this is called la raíz, the stem of the verb. And then the AR there, the ending, is called la terminación. And remember, there are 3 terminaciones in Spanish. This is an AR verb, there's an ER verb, and there's an IR verb. So, here we go. We want to conjugate a regular AR verb like tocar. We take off that AR, so notice the terminación here at the bottom is crossed out. And then we're going to add on these new endings. Now, once you get these endings memorized, what you see here in red, these conjugation endings, once you have these memorized, you will be able to conjugate any regular AR verb in the Spanish language, whether you know it or not. You'll be able, rather, whether you know what it means or not, you'll be able to conjugate it simply by following this process. So this information I'm sharing with you right here is very, very important. So we take off the AR, and then the first person singular is toco. I touch or I play. Tocas, take off the AR and add the AS, second person singular. You touch. Toca, take off that AR and just add the A, toca, third person singular. Now let's go up to the first person plural. We touch, tocamos. You take off the AR and add the AMOS. Second person plural, tocais. A, notice that accent mark is on the A and not the I. It's a very common mistake. The accent mark goes on the A. And then tocan. Toco, tocas, toca, tocamos, tocais, tocan. This is conjugation for regular AR verbs. Now, here we see an example of an ER verb. This is also from your vocab, leer. Leer means to read, leer. And notice it's an ER verb. Now, the endings we just learned are only for AR verbs. We'll have to learn some new ones for ER verbs, but they're surprisingly similar, so hopefully you'll notice the pattern here. The stem of this ER verb is simply that LE that you see in orange there. That's the stem, la raíz of the verb. And then the terminación, the ending, is ER. So let's look at how we conjugate this regular ER verb. We take off the ER, and here are your new endings. Leo, lees, lee, leemos, leéis, and leen. Hopefully you're noticing how similar these are to the AR verbs. In fact, an easy way to remember this, once you have your AR verb endings down, the ER ones just simply replace all of the A's with an E. So the yo form still just ends in an O. The tu form, instead of AS, it's ES. The third person singular, instead of A, it's an E. First person plural, instead of amos, it's emos. Second person plural, instead of ais, it's eis. And third person plural, instead of an, it's en. Just replace all of the A's with E's, and then you have your ER verb endings. Easy peasy. Now, if you run into a regular ER verb in the future, which there are lots of them, and you will run into them, I promise you, you will be able to conjugate it simply by knowing these endings. And then we have our third verb ending. This is also from our vocab list, escribir. It means to write. The raíz, the stem of this verb, is escrib. And la terminación, the ending, is an IR. This is an IR verb, which means that we're going to have different endings for these types of verbs as well. However, once again, they're very similar, in fact, even more similar to the ER verb endings. Let's have a look at these. You ready? So we still see our stem here, the part that doesn't change of the verb, escribe, 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 all in the orange. And now our new endings. Look how similar these are to the ER verb endings. O, es, e, all exactly the same. However, first person plural, instead of hemos, we have imos. Second person plural, instead of eis, we have is. And that is an accent mark on that I. All right, there is an accent mark on that I. That's not just the dot. And then we go back to the exact same one as the ER verbs in the third person plural, escriben. So, to say I write, escribo. You write, escribes. She writes, escribe. We write, escribimos. Y'all write, escribís. And they write, escriben. O-S-E, imos, is, en. So just highlighting the fact here that these are identical to the ER verbs except for the first person plural and the second person plural. So ER and IR have a lot in common. All right, so here we see the process. This is your infinitive. Look, I've written it 6 times for you. Dedicar, to dedicate. We take off the ending, which with what remains is the stem, and then we add our new endings on here. Here we go. Dedico, dedicas, dedica, dedicamos, dedicáis, dedican. Let's look at an ER verb. Now, we've never seen this verb deber before, but it's regular, so you know how to conjugate it. First step is take off our ER ending, and we get our stem, deb. And then we add our new endings, debo, debes, debe, debemos, debeis, deben. Let's look at an IR example, abrir. We've never studied this verb, abrir, and we don't need to know what it even means in order to be able to conjugate it. It means to open, by the way. And then, so we take off our IR ending, and we add our new conjugation endings. Abro, abres, abre, abrimos, abrís, abren. So, let's review what we've talked about in this lesson. First, a verb before it is conjugated is called an infinitivo, an infinitive. Infinitivos in español end in AR, ER, and IR. Those are the only possible endings for infinitives in Spanish. And then the part of the verb before the ending, that is, before the AR, ER, IR, the part of the verb that doesn't change when we conjugate it, that's called the raíz, the stem. And here you can see a summary of the AR, ER, and IR verb endings. AR, o, as, a, amos, ais, an. ER, o, es, e, hemos, eis, en. And IR, o, es, e, imos, is, en.
Gracias por su atención y su tiempo. Hasta la próxima lección. Chao.